The moment the front door exploded inward, splinters scattering across the dining room like shrapnel, Roberto Martinez knew that some meals are destined to end in blood. 3 men in dark clothing stormed through the threshold, their faces partially concealed by bandanas, the unmistakable tattoos of MS-13 crawling up their necks like serpents. Seeking prey, the sound of Sophia's champagne glass shattering against the hardwood floor punctuated the screams that erupted from around the table, where moments before, the Martinez family had been toasting their daughter's acceptance to medical school. Roberto's wife Maria clutched her chest, her face draining of color, while their son, Diego, instinctively moved to shield his younger sister. The largest of the intruders raised a weapon skyward and fired a single shot into the ceiling, raining plaster dust down upon the untouched plates of arroz con pollo that would now grow cold with fear. Time seemed to fragment and slow, each heartbeat thundering in Roberto's ears as he calculated the impossible odds of his family surviving the next hour. This was supposed to be the happiest night of their lives, a celebration of hope and achievement, but the universe had other plans written in violence and desperation. The gang leader stepped forward, his boots crunching over broken glass and scattered flowers from the centerpiece that had toppled in the chaos. His eyes swept across the terrified faces with the cold assessment of a predator selecting prey, finally settling on Roberto with an intensity that suggested this invasion was anything but random. He demanded something hidden in the house, something left behind by people who no longer lived there, his voice carrying the weight of threats that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Roberto's mind raced through possibilities, through the year they'd owned this modest home in the suburbs, trying to comprehend what contraband or currency could be concealed within these walls. The other 2 gang members moved with practiced efficiency, herding the family together, their weapons never wavering, their young faces hardened by streets that had stolen whatever innocence they once possessed. Sophia's medical school acceptance letter lay on the table beside her plate, the embossed university seal now seeming like a cruel joke, a future that might never arrive. Maria began to pray softly in Spanish, her trembling hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white against her brown skin. Diego's jaw clenched with barely contained rage, his athletic frame coiled like a spring, and Roberto caught his son's eye with a subtle shake of his head, a silent plea for patience in a moment that demanded impossible restraint. The youngest gang member, who couldn't have been more than 17, kept glancing toward the family photos on the wall, his weapon hand shaking almost imperceptibly, suggesting some fragment of humanity still flickered beneath the hardened exterior. The gang leader began overturning furniture, ripping cushions, his frustration mounting with each empty discovery, and Roberto understood with sickening clarity that their lives hung on finding something they didn't possess. The celebration that was meant to honor Sophia's achievement, her years of sacrifice and late-night studying, had transformed into a hostage situation where every second stretched into eternity. The smell of fear mixed with the aroma of the carefully prepared meal, creating a surreal contrast between domesticity and danger that would haunt them forever. Roberto's chef instincts, honed over decades in kitchens where timing meant everything, told him that desperation was the most dangerous ingredient in any crisis. As the gang leader's search grew more violent, more frantic, Roberto knew they were running out of time before frustration turned into something far worse. The ornate dining table his grandfather had built by hand now served as a barrier between his family and 3 young men who had likely killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do so again. Sophia caught her father's gaze, her intelligent eyes asking the question none of them could voice. Whether this was truly how their story would end, whether her acceptance letter would become a memorial instead of a beginning. The gang leader suddenly stopped his destruction, turned back to face them with a decision forming behind his dark eyes, and Roberto felt the temperature in the room drop as they approached a threshold from which there would be no return. In that crystallized moment of terror, surrounded by the ruins of their celebration, the Martinez family understood that survival would require more than luck or prayer. It would demand something none of them had prepared for. Roberto Martinez straightened his spine with the quiet dignity of a man who had spent 40 years commanding kitchens where chaos bowed to precision and purpose. His voice, when it emerged, carried none of the tremor that shook his hands, steady as the blade he'd once wielded through countless services where timing separated sustenance from disaster. He addressed the gang leader directly, proposing something ancient and sacred, an offer that hung in the air like incense, in a cathedral built from desperation and improbable hope. "Before anyone dies tonight," Roberto said, his accent thick with the mountains of his childhood, "let me cook one final meal for everyone here, a tradition from my village, where even condemned men deserve to taste life before they meet whatever comes next." The gang leader's head tilted with dangerous curiosity, his weapon lowering slightly as confusion registered across features hardened by violence and survival. Maria's sharp intake of breath suggested she thought her husband had lost his mind, but Sophia recognized something flickering in her father's eyes, that same focused intensity he wore when solving impossible problems in the restaurant they'd lost years ago. The gang leader laughed. A bitter sound scraped raw from a throat that had forgotten gentler expressions. Yet something in Roberto's proposition seemed to pierce through layers of armor built from street warfare and broken promises. "You think food matters now, old man?" he asked, gesturing with his weapon toward the ruins of their celebration, though his eyes betrayed a hunger that transcended mere appetite. Roberto nodded slowly, moving with deliberate calm toward the kitchen doorway, his movements telegraphing submission while his mind calculated angles and possibilities that only a lifetime of precision could conjure. "Everyone eats," Roberto replied simply, "even those who come uninvited, even those who bring death into homes that once held only love and ordinary dreams." The youngest gang member's stomach growled audibly in the heavy silence, a humanizing sound that cracked the tension momentarily, reminding everyone that monsters still possessed bodies that demanded sustenance. The gang leader considered this unexpected offer, perhaps remembering meals from a childhood before violence consumed everything, before survival required forgetting the simple comfort of sitting together over shared food. "1 hour, he finally declared. "Cook your last supper, chef. But if you're playing games, your daughter pays first." Roberto entered the kitchen with Maria trailing behind, her whispered protests urgent against his neck as he began pulling ingredients from the refrigerator with hands that now moved with ceremonial purpose. He selected each element carefully: garlic, cilantro, peppers that would fill the house with aromas capable of awakening buried memories in even the most hardened souls. His fingers moved through familiar patterns, chopping and preparing, but his eyes found Diego's face through the doorway, beginning a silent conversation in the language they'd developed during those long-ago years working side by side in their family restaurant. Each gesture carried double meaning, each movement of his knife against the cutting board a coded message that his son's sharp mind began decoding with growing understanding. Roberto crushed garlic with the side of his blade, 3 times, then 2, the rhythm they'd used to signal timing during rush services when verbal communication drowned beneath the chaos of a packed dining room. Diego's almost imperceptible nod confirmed receipt of the message, his body shifting slightly, positioning himself with the patience of someone who understood that survival sometimes required the precise timing of a perfect reduction. The kitchen became Roberto's cathedral, each ingredient a prayer offered up to gods of chance and desperate strategy, while in the dining room his family waited beneath the watchful eyes of young men who'd forgotten that humanity once connected them all. He worked with the focused intensity of an artist creating his masterpiece, knowing that this meal carried weight beyond flavor or sustenance, that every minute he stretched, preparing it, was another minute for opportunity to reveal itself. The aroma of sofrito began filling the house, that foundational smell of Latin cooking that speaks of home and safety, of grandmothers and celebrations, of life continuing despite everything that seeks to end it. Roberto stirred the pot with his wooden spoon, the same one his mother had used, and caught the youngest gang member's eyes drifting toward the kitchen, drawn by smells that surely awakened something he'd been trained to bury beneath violence and loyalty. This meal would be his weapon, his strategy, his final stand, not served on plates, but woven through time and memory, buying precious moments where none seemed to exist, transforming their prison into something that might yet become their salvation. Roberto's knife moved through the red peppers with rhythmic precision, each slice falling away like seconds measured in scarlet crescents, while his left hand traced the rim of the copper pot twice, their old signal meaning, "Watch the door." Diego shifted his weight in the dining room, seemingly adjusting his position for comfort. But Roberto recognized the subtle repositioning that placed his son within striking distance of the distracted guard near the hallway. The wooden spoon became an extension of Roberto's will as he stirred clockwise 3 times, then counterclockwise once, spelling out patience in movements that looked like nothing more than an old chef's superstitious habits. Maria moved beside him, washing cilantro with trembling hands, until Roberto squeezed her wrist gently. 3 short pulses, 1 long, the Morse code of their marriage, communicating trust where words would betray them. Through the archway, Sophia's eyes flickered between her father and brother, her medical training recognizing patterns in chaos, understanding blooming across her face as she grasped the silent choreography unfolding between chopping blocks and hostage chairs. The rice hit the heated oil with a satisfying hiss that masked Roberto's whispered instructions to Maria, his voice barely audible beneath. The kitchen symphony he orchestrated with deliberate loudness. He reached for the saffron with his right hand while his left fingers drummed against the counter. Tap, tap, pause, tap, the sequence they'd used during fire inspections when coordinating staff movements without alerting authorities to their overcrowded kitchen. Diego coughed twice. Confirmation received, his hand drifting casually toward the heavy ceramic vase on the side table. A movement so natural it registered as nervous fidgeting rather than tactical preparation. Roberto added chicken stock to the pot with theatrical flourish, the steam rising like incense, while he caught his son's reflection in the polished copper, calculating angles and distances with the geometric precision of someone who'd spent decades navigating tight kitchen spaces where inches separated efficiency from disaster. The gang members grew restless, but remained anchored by hunger, and the hypnotic aromatics filling every corner of their temporary prison, their weapons lowering incrementally, as ancient instincts responded to the promise of sustenance. Roberto assembled plates with the reverence of a priest preparing communion, each dish a decoy in his elaborate misdirection, while his hands continued their secret vocabulary across cutting boards and serving platters. He crushed cumin seeds in the mortar with varying rhythms. Fast, slow, fast, fast, spelling out timing in percussion that only Diego's trained ear could decipher beneath the orchestrated chaos of final preparations. The youngest gang member had drifted closer to the kitchen doorway, drawn by memories embedded in the smell of adobo and citrus, his weapon hanging loose against his side, as Roberto intended, as the plan required, as desperation demanded. The youngest gang member's hand trembled against the rifle strap as the scent of Roberto's sofrito reached him, garlic, tomato and culantro, blending into something that cracked open a memory he'd buried beneath ink and initiation scars. His name was Miguel, though the streets called him Phantasma, and his eyes fixed on Sophia with a recognition that drained the blood from his hardened face. She sat perfectly still at the dining table, her acceptance letter to medical school visible in her lap, and he saw not the hostage before him, but the young woman in blue scrubs who'd held his sister Lupita through an asthma attack 2 winters ago at the Esperanza Community Center. Roberto noticed the shift immediately, the way Miguel's breathing changed, how his finger slipped away from the trigger guard, the moisture gathering at the corners of eyes trained to show nothing but stone. "You," Miguel whispered. The word breaking like something fragile dropped from a great height, and Sophia's head turned slowly toward him, her own recognition blooming into comprehension that recalibrated every calculation in the room. The other gang members registered the change in their youngest brother, hands tightening on weapons, as Miguel took an unsteady step toward Sophia, his voice rising with an emotion that violated every code he'd sworn to uphold. "You saved Lupita. You stayed with us in that waiting room until dawn. You gave my mother your own jacket." His crew leader barked a command to stay in position, but Miguel's armor was fracturing, years of forced numbness splitting apart as he remembered Sophia's hands demonstrating breathing exercises, her refusal to leave until his sister's fever. Broke, her humanity offered without judgment to a family wearing their poverty and desperation like visible wounds. Roberto stirred the pot with deliberate calm, understanding this unraveling was both opportunity and danger, that a young man remembering his heart could either save them all or accelerate their destruction. Sophia rose slowly from her chair, her movements measured and gentle, as if approaching a wounded animal, her voice carrying the same steadiness she'd learned in emergency rooms where panic was contagion. "Miguel, your sister drew me a picture of butterflies. I still have it on my refrigerator. She wanted to be an artist." The words landed like absolution, and Miguel's face contorted with a grief too large for his 17 years, tears cutting tracks through the careful menace he'd constructed. His crew watched with predatory alertness as their youngest member's loyalty visibly wavered, while Roberto continued cooking, his hands never stopping their secret signals, even as he witnessed redemption's fragile emergence in a boy who'd forgotten he was ever anything but a ghost. Roberto's hands moved through the final preparation of ropa vieja with the precision of a man who'd spent decades translating love into sustenance, but his eyes carried a weight that transcended the immediate danger surrounding his family. He wiped his palms on the apron that had survived 3 restaurant closures and a bankruptcy, then reached into his shirt pocket to retrieve a folded envelope, yellowed by time and worn soft at its creases from years of waiting. "I worked in a correctional facility kitchen for 8 years after my restaurant failed," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the tension-thick room to where the gang leader stood. "And in that place, I learned that every man, no matter what brought him there, still hungered for something that tasted like home, like memory, like the person he was before the world taught him to be hard." The gang leader's attention sharpened with predatory focus, his weapon still raised but his curiosity visibly piqued by this shift in the old man's demeanor. Roberto placed the envelope on the counter beside the fragrant pot of stewed beef, his weathered fingers resting on it like a blessing or a burden too long carried. "There was a man called Santos. Everyone respected him, feared him even behind those walls, and he told stories about his son with a pride that broke through everything prison tried to strip away." The gang leader's breathing changed perceptibly, his shoulders stiffening as recognition began its cruel work, while his crew exchanged uncertain glances at this unexpected turn in their hostage scenario. "Santos got sick in his final months, and I'd bring him caldo de pollo that he could actually keep down, and we'd talk about legacy, about the messages we leave behind when our time comes calling." Roberto's eyes met the gang leader's directly now, without challenge, but with a profound dignity that commanded attention despite the imbalance of power. "He gave me this letter with instructions to find his son, described the tattoo on Your neck exactly. The scar above your left eyebrow. He knew you by heart, even though years and choices had built walls between you. The envelope sat between them like unexploded ordnance, its presence recalibrating every assumption about how this night would unfold. Roberto's voice carried the gentle insistence of someone who'd learned that truth, once spoken, could never be fully silenced, regardless of the threats surrounding it. He made me promise on my own children's lives that I'd deliver his words to you, and I've carried this burden searching, always searching, never imagining you'd come to my door. The gang leader's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he stared at the letter, his carefully constructed authority fracturing against the possibility of his father's voice reaching across death itself. Roberto remained still, a humble man who'd transformed into something larger through sheer moral presence, understanding that some recipes required not heat but time, not force but patience, not violence but the devastating power of love that refuses to die even when everything else has turned to ash. The gang leader's tattooed fingers trembled as they reached toward the envelope, his hardened exterior cracking like ancient plaster under the weight of a name he hadn't heard spoken with tenderness in over a decade. Roberto watched with the quiet intensity of a man who understood that some moments arrive clothed in violence but carry seeds of transformation, his calloused hands still resting near the pot of ropa vieja whose steam rose like prayers between them. The room held its breath as the envelope was torn open with more care than brutality, revealing pages covered in the shaky handwriting of a dying man who'd hoarded his final strength for this confession. The gang leader's eyes moved across words that stripped away years of armor, his jaw clenching against emotions he'd trained himself to bury beneath layers of calculated cruelty. His crew shifted uncomfortably, sensing their leader's authority dissolving into something raw and undefended, while Sophia's family remained frozen witnesses to a reckoning none of them could have scripted. My son, if you're reading this, then the man who kept his promise succeeded where I failed. I never learned how to reach you with anything but disappointment and distance. The gang leader's voice emerged broken as he read aloud, compelled by forces beyond his control to share his father's testimony. Roberto's expression carried no triumph, only the solemn recognition of a man who'd carried another's burden across years of uncertainty and was finally laying it down. The words continued their devastating work, revealing truths about switched identities at birth, about a boy raised in another family's home, while his biological parents grieved the child they'd lost to hospital confusion and bureaucratic failure. The revelation landed like physical blows. Every choice, every act of violence, every burned bridge suddenly recontextualized by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Sophia's mother clutched her rosary with white-knuckled intensity, understanding they were witnessing someone's entire reality collapse and rebuild itself in real time. The letter's final paragraph carried the concentrated weight of deathbed clarity, each word precisely chosen by a father who'd spent his last conscious hours attempting to redirect a son's trajectory toward redemption rather than destruction. You carry my name, but you were never meant for my path. Leave this life that devours its children. Honor the mother who raised you with love I couldn't provide. Become the man your gentle heart wanted to be before the streets taught you to mistake cruelty for strength. The gang leader's weapon lowered incrementally as tears carved paths through the mask of intimidation he'd worn like identity itself. Roberto remained standing in his kitchen, transformed into confessional, his simple act of keeping a promise becoming the catalyst that might spare his family while offering salvation to the man who'd threatened everything he loved. The uneaten meal waited on the table, steam still rising, while destiny hung suspended between violence and grace. Diego's muscles coiled with the precision of a man who'd spent years lifting stockpots and wrestling with commercial ovens, his body reading the fractional shift in the gang leader's attention, like a chef recognizing the exact moment oil reaches perfect temperature. The letter had created a pocket of vulnerability, a hairline fracture in the arm tension that had held his family hostage for what felt like lifetimes compressed into hours. His father's eyes met his across the kitchen with that familiar look they'd shared thousands of times in their restaurant, the silent signal that meant now, move. Now trust your instincts and commit completely. Diego launched himself toward the nearest gang member whose weapon had drifted downward, hands trembling as he watched his leader dissolve into raw emotion none of them had witnessed before. The collision sent both men crashing into the carefully set dining table, plates shattering into crystalline fragments that caught the overhead light like falling stars. Sophia's scream merged with her mother's prayers as the room exploded from stillness into chaos, bodies moving with the desperate energy of people fighting for breath underwater. Roberto moved simultaneously toward his daughter, placing his considerable frame between her and the violence, erupting across his home like wildfire, consuming everything it touched. The youngest gang member, the 17-year-old whose sister Sophia had saved, stood frozen for exactly 3 heartbeats before his own weapon rose not toward Diego, but toward his crew member struggling to aim at the family patriarch. His voice cracked with adolescent uncertainty, transformed into sudden conviction, as he shouted words that would exile him forever from the only belonging he'd known since childhood. "Drop it. Drop the gun, or I swear I'll shoot. I won't let you hurt them. Not her. Not the family of the person who gave my sister life when everyone else looked away." His hands shook violently, but his stance held firm, torn between 2 impossible loyalties, while his leader remained locked in his own internal war. The crew member he'd aimed at stared back with betrayal, etched across features hardened by years of survival in territories where mercy meant weakness and compassion invited destruction. Roberto registered this fracture in the gang's unity with the strategic mind that had once orchestrated kitchen brigades during impossible dinner rushes, recognizing that divided attention created opportunities for protection and escape. The air itself seemed electrified with competing desperations. Diego grappling for control of a weapon, the young gang member holding his own brothers at gunpoint, Sophia's family pressed against walls that had only ever known laughter and celebration until tonight. The weapon Diego fought for discharged into the ceiling, plaster raining down like apocalyptic snow, while the percussion echoed through every corner of the house with devastating finality. His opponent's elbow caught him across the jaw, but Diego held on with the stubborn determination inherited from generations who'd survived by refusing to surrender what mattered most, his fingers desperately seeking the gun's grip while his body absorbed blows meant to break his hold. The youngest gang member's weapon tracked between targets as another crew member turned toward him, the geometry of betrayal reorganizing itself moment by moment into configurations nobody could have predicted when they'd first breached the Martinez family's door. Roberto's voice cut through the chaos with surprising authority, the same commanding tone he'd used to direct kitchens, now deployed to freeze desperate men in mid-motion. "Enough blood in this house. My food grows cold while we decide whether to be human or animals, whether this night ends with more sons leaving their fathers letters that never get delivered." His words landed with unexpected weight, carrying the moral authority of a man who'd kept impossible promises across years and circumstances that would have absolved lesser people from trying. The struggle reached its apex as Diego finally wrenched the weapon free, immediately sliding it across the floor toward his father rather than wielding it himself, understanding instinctively that armed civilians often died from their own desperation. The youngest gang member lowered his own weapon incrementally, tears streaming down his face as he stood in the terrible space between 2 worlds, having just crossed a line that meant he could never return to the only identity he'd constructed from childhood's ruins. The gang leader slowly raised his head from his father's letter, his eyes landing on the scene of fractured loyalties and scattered violence, with the expression of someone waking from nightmares into realities somehow worse than dreams. Sophia remained pressed against her mother, both women clutching each other while witnessing masculinity stripped to its raw components, violence and protection, betrayal and sacrifice, the thin margins that separated destruction from salvation. The kitchens, and carefully prepared meal sat waiting like an answered prayer nobody had known to request, its steam still rising toward heaven while the people surrounding it stood balanced on the knife's edge between who they'd been and who they might still become. The gang leader rose to his full height with the mechanical slowness of a man lifting unbearable weight. His father's letter clutched in one hand, while the other retrieved his weapon from where it had fallen during the chaos that had transformed the Martinez dining room into a battlefield of competing redemptions. His eyes, dark pools that had witnessed and orchestrated violence since childhood, now carried something different, a fracture in the armor that street survival had welded around whatever remained of the boy his father had once known. He raised the gun with terrible deliberation, his arm extending until the barrel's dark eyes stared at his own crew, then shifted toward the family, then back again, the weapon itself seeming confused about which life he intended to inhabit in, whatever moments remained before sirens transformed possibility into consequence. Roberto stood motionless, his chef's hands empty, but somehow commanding, embodying the dignity of men who'd built worlds from nothing and refused to abandon their principles, even when pragmatism counseled surrender. The gang leader's voice emerged broken, each word dragged from depths where conflicting identities waged civil war within a single human frame, barely old enough to have accumulated so many contradictory selves. My father writes about a son who doesn't exist anymore, about some kid who liked drawing pictures and helping his abuela cook tamales before everything turned to ash and survival meant becoming something that wouldn't get swallowed by streets that eat soft things for breakfast. His weapon wavered between trajectories, between the family whose continued breathing represented witnesses and complications, and his own crew whose loyalty suddenly felt like chains, binding him to an identity his father had died begging him to shed. The youngest gang member remained frozen in his own betrayal's aftermath, his weapon lowered, but his position declared, standing closer to Sophia's family than to brothers who'd just become strangers through choices measured in heartbeats. Roberto's voice carried the gentle authority of fathers speaking truth to sons, losing their way in darkness that promised belonging but delivered only emptiness dressed in colors and hand signs. You point that weapon at my family, and you prove your father wasted his final thoughts on someone already dead, or you lower it and discover whether any part of that boy who drew pictures still breathes underneath the armor you wear. Roberto's words landed like benediction and challenge simultaneously, his body deliberately stepping toward the barrel rather than away from it, demonstrating the fearlessness of men who'd already survived their own forms of imprisonment and emerged committed to different codes. The gang leader's hand shook violently, his face contorting with the agony of someone being torn in half by competing gravities, the life he'd built through violence and the son his father had loved existing in impossible simultaneity. His finger rested against the trigger, while tears cut channels through the hard geography of his face, this brutal calculus of identity playing out in the space between intention and action, between the man he'd become and the boy who'd been buried, but perhaps not completely extinguished. The standoff stretched into eternity, compressed into seconds, every person in that room suspended in the terrible space where one man's choice would determine whether families remained whole or shattered, whether redemption existed for people who'd traveled too far into darkness to find their way back toward light. Sophia watched this young man, barely older than herself, wrestling with the weight of inherited violence, and discovered unexpected compassion rising in her chest, the same instinct that had driven her toward medicine and service, now recognizing another human drowning in circumstances that had shaped him before he'd developed strength to resist their current. His weapon slowly, incrementally lowered as sirens grew louder in the distance, approaching with the inevitability of consequences, finally arriving to collect debts accumulated across years of choices that had seemed survival, but might have been slow suicide. Roberto's meal sat waiting on the table like a testament to civilization's fragile persistence, steam still rising, as if believing human beings might yet choose to sit together and break bread rather than each other. Sophia moved before thought could transform into hesitation, her body rising from where she'd been crouched beside her sobbing mother with the fluid grace of someone stepping into purpose rather than danger, crossing the space between safety and the gun's trembling barrel, with footsteps that somehow made no sound against the dining room floor, scattered with broken glass and overturned chairs. Her hands remained visible and empty, palms forward in universal gesture of peaceful intention, but her eyes carried something more powerful than weapons, the unwavering conviction of someone who'd looked directly into suffering and chosen connection over fear. The gang leader's weapon tracked her movement with mechanical reflex, even as confusion flickered across features still wet with tears. This young woman, advancing toward him, violating every survival script his streets had written. Roberto tensed but didn't intervene, recognizing in his daughter's movement the same determination he'd carried into prison kitchens where feeding humanity to forgotten men had been his own form of quiet revolution. The sirens screamed closer now, maybe 2 blocks away, time collapsing into its final moments before choices became irreversible consequences. Sophia's voice emerged steady and clear, carrying the particular authority of healers who'd held dying hands and witnessed what humans became when stripped of pretense and posturing in suffering's absolute democracy. Your father spent his final 3 weeks in the prison hospital where I volunteered before, medical school, and I read him your letters, the ones you sent when you were 14, before you stopped writing, when you still signed them Mijo who loves you. Her words landed like physical blows, each syllable peeling away layers of armor the gang leader had constructed between his present and past selves. She took another step closer, now, near enough that the weapon's barrel almost touched her chest, this proximity to violence somehow rendering her more powerful rather than vulnerable. He told me about the boy who'd draw elaborate sketches of imaginary cities where families stayed together and streets didn't swallow children. And he made me promise that if I ever became a doctor, I'd remember that every patient carried someone's son, someone's hope, someone's drawing of a better world that circumstances had erased but maybe not completely destroyed. The gang leader's face contorted with recognition and anguish, the weapon lowering fractionally as memory warred with the identity he'd built from necessity and survival's brutal mathematics. Sophia pressed forward into this opening, her medical school training and her father's example combining into something transcendent, the courage of ordinary people refusing to accept that violence must answer violence in endless cycles that devoured generations. My entire essay was about breaking those cycles, about seeing past the ink and scars and choices that poverty and abandonment forced on children who deserved protection, but received only streets that taught them power and fear were the only currencies that mattered. Her hand slowly, carefully reached toward his weapon, with the same gentleness she'd used, touching fevered foreheads in hospital wards where humanity's fragility became undeniable. The gun fell from his grip as sobs racked his frame, this young man collapsing under the weight of recognition that violence had never been strength, but merely the armor of someone too afraid to remain soft in a world that punished softness without mercy. Sophia caught him as he fell, supporting this stranger who'd invaded her family's celebration with intentions of harm, but who she now recognized as another victim of circumstances that predated his first breath, systems that manufactured soldiers from children who'd wanted only safety and belonging. The Martinez family watched this impossible pieta, their daughter holding the man who'd threatened their lives, and understood they were witnessing something sacred, the precise moment when revenge's gravity released its hold and different futures became imaginable, even in dining rooms, still carrying violence's fresh evidence. Roberto's meal waited on the table behind them, this feast prepared under duress, now transformed into communion nobody had eaten, but everyone had somehow shared. Proof that even in darkness, shaped by faction conflicts and inherited trauma, ordinary people possessed extraordinary capacity to choose connection over continuation of cycles that had already claimed too many sons, too many families, too many futures sacrificed to streets that promised belonging but delivered only beautiful, brutal, ultimately hollow forms of slow death dressed as survival. The gang leader rose from Sophia's embrace with movements that carried decades of exhaustion, despite his 23 years, pulling the crumpled letter from his pocket and pressing it into Roberto's weathered hands with the solemnity of someone returning sacred relics to their rightful guardian. His remaining crew members stood frozen in various states of shock and recognition, weapons lowered, faces revealing the boys they'd been before. Streets and survival had rewritten their features into masks of premature hardness. He turned toward the door as sirens screamed their final approach, blue and red lights already painting the walls with law's unforgiving colors, but paused at the threshold where celebration had transformed into crisis hours that felt like lifetimes ago. His voice emerged rough but clear, carrying command that now served protection rather than threat. Nobody here knows our names, nobody saw our faces, and these people fed us when we were hungry, because that's what decent people do. You forget us, and we disappear like we were never real. His crew fled into darkness that had birthed them, leaving only the youngest member who positioned himself beside Sophia with the determination of someone choosing different scripts than those his circumstances had written. Roberto moved to the table where his elaborate meal waited in cooling silence. This feast, prepared under duress, now carrying meaning its ingredients could never contain alone. Beans and rice and carefully seasoned meat transformed into testament of humanity's refusal to surrender dignity even when violence demanded submission. He began, plating portions with the same precise care he'd brought to prison kitchens, where feeding forgotten men had been his quiet revolution, serving his family and the young gang member who'd chosen redemption with movements that honored both survival and the sacred ordinary act of sharing food. Sophia's mother, Maria, finally rose from where shock had pinned her, moving to her daughter's side and touching her face with hands that trembled but held her with fierce pride. This girl who'd walked toward weapons with nothing but conviction that healing must answer violence if cycles were ever to break. The Martinez family gathered around their table, this celebration of Sophia's acceptance to medical school now carrying additional weight. Proof that education and compassion could transform even evenings that had promised only tragedy into moments when different futures announced themselves possible. The gang leader remained as promised when police surrounded the house, kneeling with hands visible in ancient gesture of surrender, choosing accountability over flight and decision that honored his father's final wishes, and Sophia's courage that had reminded him of the boy who'd drawn imaginary cities where families stayed whole. Officers found a dining room that told competing stories. Overturned furniture and broken glass, speaking of violence, but a table set with careful beauty, suggesting something more complex had unfolded than simple categories of victim and perpetrator could contain. Roberto stood beside Sophia as they gave statements. This father and daughter partnership of chef and healer, representing the quiet strength of humble people who'd faced circumstances designed to destroy them, but discovered reserves of dignity that chaos couldn't reach. The youngest gang member, barely 17, chose to stay and face consequences rather than flee. Sophia's hand on his shoulder as he wept for his sister and the childhood poverty and abandonment had stolen, her presence promising that even street soldiers might find paths toward different tomorrows. The untouched meal remained on the table after police had documented and departed. This feast nobody had eaten, but everyone had shared, becoming the story the Martinez family would carry forward. Proof that ordinary people facing extraordinary darkness possessed capacity to choose connection over cycles that had already consumed too many sons, too many futures, too many families sacrificed to violence dressed as survival's only option. What would you have done if violence came to your family's table? Subscribe to hear more stories of ordinary courage in impossible moments.